His tall frame seemed almost too rigid, as though he was forcing himself not to collapse under the weight of his own loss. When the cat appeared, John's chest tightened. He recognized it, not by name, but by presence. It was the stray that had haunted his backyard for weeks, always lurking, yet never letting him close. Why had it chosen this moment, this coffin, this farewell? The priest tried to continue, but the sound of the rain against the canvas grew louder, mingling with the muffled sobs. The cat shifted, pressing its face against the coffin's lid, and let out a low, trembling cry. It wasn't a meow of demand, but of ache, vibrating with something deeper than hunger. The sound sliced through the gathering, more piercing than words could ever be. Several mourners lowered their heads, unable to hold back tears. John felt his knees weaken.
That cry, it echoed the silence he carried inside, the silence of every night spent alone after his brother's passing. He clenched his jaw, fighting against the tide rising in his chest. The cat's small body trembled in the cold, yet it remained unmoving, as if guarding the coffin against an invisible threat. No one dared approach. A clap of thunder broke the stillness, startling the crowd. The cat flinched but didn't leap away. Instead, it pressed down harder against the coffin, its claws barely scratching the polished surface. John took a step forward, then froze. What if it ran? What if disturbing it shattered this unexplainable moment? He could feel everyone's eyes on him, silently urging him to do something, to act. His boots sank into the mud as he approached, slowly, one step at a time. The rain trickled down his face, mixing with the heat of unshed tears. The closer he came, the clearer the cat's trembling became. It was soaked to the bone, its thin tail curled protectively around itself. John extended a hand, hesitant, the way one might reach for a flame that could both burn or warm. The cat lifted its head and stared at him, its eyes glistening like broken glass. Something shifted in the air. The mourners held their breath. John's fingers hovered inches from the fragile creature, unsure whether it would scratch, leap, or accept. The rain hammered the tent harder, drowning every sound except the fragile rhythm of his own heartbeat. In that fragile pause, the cat leaned forward, resting its damp head against his trembling hand. A wave of gasps broke through the crowd, an unspoken release, a shared wound exposed and soothed in the same instant. The silence that followed was so profound it seemed even the rain dared not disturb it. John's rough hand lingered on the cat's fragile head, the warmth of life pulsing beneath its soaked fur.
The animal's body quivered, not in fear but in exhaustion, as though every ounce of strength had been used just to climb atop that coffin. Some mourners began to sob openly, while others pressed tissues to their faces, unable to articulate the weight of what they were witnessing. It wasn't just a cat on a coffin, it was grief made flesh. The priest faltered, his voice cracking as he tried to resume the ceremony. But the rhythm of the service had been broken, replaced by the raw heartbeat of this fragile creature. The cat pressed its cheek harder against John's palm, and he felt something shift inside him, a fragile thread reconnecting where loss had torn everything apart. For a fleeting moment, the coffin between them seemed less like an ending and more like a bridge. A sudden gust of wind rattled the tent, blowing rain into the open sides and extinguishing 2 candles at the foot of the coffin. The crowd startled, umbrellas snapped, and a murmur of unease spread. The cat jerked its head, claws digging lightly into the polished wood, ready to flee. John instinctively cupped his hand over its trembling back, whispering words no one else could hear. The sound was lost to the storm, but the gesture steadied the animal. It stayed. John's sister, standing near the first row, clutched her chest and whispered through her tears, "He used to feed that cat." Her words rippled through the gathering, a revelation that struck deeper than the thunder. Murmurs spread, memories of quiet kindnesses from the man they were burying. A neighbor nodded, recalling how he had left scraps out by the fence. Suddenly, the presence of the cat wasn't coincidence. It was a living echo of the bond his brother had nurtured in silence. The cat slowly lowered its body, lying fully stretched along the coffin, as if claiming it not with ownership, but with loyalty. Its eyes fluttered half-closed, fighting the weight of fatigue.
For many in the crowd, it was unbearable. The image of a creature too fragile to fight for itself, yet unwilling to leave the one who had once kept it alive. John's throat tightened, his vision blurring as he rested his other hand gently over the animal's frail side. A fresh rumble of thunder shook the earth beneath their feet. Several children whimpered, and the elderly clutched at their coats. The priest raised his voice, trying to outmatch the storm, but the cat stirred once again. With a sudden cry, so sharp, so broken, it echoed through the cemetery, cutting across wind and rain. The sound tore through the crowd, pulling sobs from those who had held themselves too tightly until now. It wasn't just an animal's cry, it was mourning. John bent down, his lips close to the animal's ear, whispering words that were drowned by the storm. The cat's eyes flickered open, meeting his. There was no fear in them, only a strange, weary trust. As he lifted the frail body from the coffin, the crowd erupted in tears, an unplanned crescendo of grief and release. He cradled it against his chest, shielding it from the storm, as if it were a child. The coffin now stood alone under the beating rain, but something about it had changed. It no longer radiated cold absence. It was surrounded by warmth, memory, and the living continuation of love. John's arms tightened around the cat as he turned back toward the crowd. His face streaked with rain and tears. Every mourner knew, without words, that the ceremony had shifted. This was no longer just a farewell. It had become a testimony of connection, carried forward by paws too small and a heart too fragile to ignore. The storm did not ease. Sheets of rain poured over the cemetery, drumming against umbrellas, soaking flowers, and seeping into the ground where fresh earth waited. John held the trembling cat tighter, feeling its frail heartbeat flutter like a trapped bird against his chest.
His shirt clung to his skin, heavy with rain, but he did not move. He stood rooted beside the coffin, unwilling to let the animal slip back into the shadows from which it had come. The mourners watched him in silence, their grief merging with awe. The priest hesitated, then gently closed his book. There were no more words that could compete with the sight before them. Instead, he bowed his head, and the rest followed. A hush settled over the group, broken only by the cat's shallow breaths. John looked down at the creature's half-shut eyes and felt a strange warmth ignite inside him. A warmth he hadn't allowed himself since his brother's final days. It was as if the stray carried some last fragment of his brother's presence, something too tender and unfinished to be left behind. The funeral attendants began lowering the coffin into the earth. The chains rattled, the sound metallic and final. The cat stirred violently in John's arms, letting out a raw cry that made several mourners flinch. Its claws dug into his shirt, piercing his skin, but John didn't recoil. He pressed his cheek against its damp fur and whispered, "It's all right." His own voice cracked, betraying the storm inside him. For a moment, it felt as though the cat understood. Its cry softened into a broken whimper. Mud splashed as the coffin touched the bottom of the grave. The first shovel of dirt struck the lid with a hollow thud, and the sound pierced through everyone. A woman collapsed into sobs, her knees buckling. Children clung tighter to their parents. The cat writhed, twisting in John's arms, desperate, restless. He held on firmly,
his arms a cage, both protective and suffocating. Then, in an unexpected turn, the animal stilled. It raised its head and fixed its wet eyes on the grave, unblinking, unyielding, as if refusing to look away from the final farewell.
The mourners found themselves caught in the animal's gaze, as though it spoke a truth they had all been trying to suppress. Grief was not something to silence or bury. It demanded to be seen, raw and trembling. John felt his knees weaken under the weight of that realization. The ground beneath him was slick with mud, and for a heartbeat, he thought he might collapse entirely. But the warmth of the fragile body against his chest steadied him. He wasn't alone. A sudden noise shattered the moment. The crack of a large branch snapping in the distance. Heads turned sharply toward the tree line, where the storm's fury bent the oaks to their limits. The cat flinched, clinging harder to John's chest. For an instant, panic rippled through the mourners, fearing the storm might bring more danger. John instinctively pulled the animal closer, sheltering it with his body, as if guarding not only the cat, but the essence of the moment itself. The shovels continued their work, dirt piling over the coffin until it was no longer visible. Each strike into the earth echoed through the hollow space in John's chest. The cat buried its face against him, its frail body trembling with every sound. He rocked slightly, not out of choice, but out of instinct, the way one soothes a frightened child. The mourners saw it and wept harder, not because of death, but because of the undeniable force of connection before their eyes. When the last shovel of earth was thrown, the grave stood sealed, marked only by flowers already wilting under the relentless rain. John stood in silence, soaked, arms wrapped around the stray, as if it were the last living piece of his brother. He knew he couldn't let it go. The bond had been sealed not by choice, but by fate, carved in the storm and sanctified by grief. The cat tilted its head upward, looking into his face with an expression that seemed almost human in its depth, an unspoken plea, or perhaps a fragile offering of trust.
The storm began to fade, leaving behind a sky streaked with gray and the heavy scent of wet soil. Mourners drifted away slowly, their footsteps squelching in the mud, some glancing back at John with eyes red from tears. He remained standing, drenched, the frail gray cat pressed against his chest. The cemetery grew quiet, the kind of quiet that follows after thunder, where every breath feels heavier and more deliberate. John could feel the animal's fragile ribs rising and falling against him, each breath a reminder that despite everything buried that day, life was still here, trembling in his arms. He walked toward the shelter of an old oak, away from the grave, but never truly leaving it behind. The cat stirred weakly, and he lowered himself onto the damp grass, ignoring the mud that soaked through his trousers. For the first time, he really looked at the animal. Its fur was patchy, its ears torn, its eyes clouded but unbroken. Vulnerability clung to it like the rain, and yet there was a strange dignity in the way it met his gaze, as though demanding to be seen, not pitied. John lifted his hand to stroke the animal again, slower this time, with reverence rather than caution. The cat blinked, leaning faintly into his touch, and released a faint, broken purr, so fragile it was almost a whisper against the storm's aftermath. The sound cracked something deep inside him. He had not cried during the ceremony, not when the coffin was lowered, not even when the final shovelful of earth sealed the grave. But now, at the sound of that trembling purr, his chest broke open and tears ran freely down his face. He bowed his head, his forehead pressing gently against the small, damp skull. "You're not alone," he whispered hoarsely. The words were meant as a promise, but they also felt like a prayer for himself. His brother was gone,
but here in his arms was a life that refused to surrender, clinging with silent desperation.
The bond felt undeniable, born in grief but alive in resilience. A breeze swept through the cemetery, carrying the smell of rain and wet leaves. The cat shifted in his lap, curling tighter against him, its eyes fluttering closed. For a moment, John thought it might slip into stillness forever, and his heart clenched in terror. But then he felt it. The faint, steady rhythm of its purr growing stronger, fragile yet determined, a heartbeat echoing against his own. Relief surged through him, mingled with a strange sense of gratitude. As the last mourners disappeared beyond the gate, John removed his jacket and wrapped it carefully around the cat, shielding it from the lingering chill. He stood slowly, cradling the small bundle to his chest as if carrying something sacred. His boots left deep prints in the muddy earth, each step leading him away from the grave, but closer to something unexpected: renewal. The cat stirred once, lifting its head just enough to press its wet nose against his chin. That tiny gesture undid him more than any words could have. He stopped walking, overcome, and looked back one last time at the fresh mound of earth. The flowers lay scattered and wilted, but in his arms was proof that love leaves traces we cannot bury. His brother's kindness had survived, carried forward by fragile paws and a trembling body that had chosen this moment to appear. The cat nestled deeper into the crook of his arm, as though surrendering fully to trust. It was the final gesture, the silent acceptance that bound them. With the storm finally breaking into light, John stepped through the gates of the cemetery, no longer just a man in mourning. He carried more than grief in his arms. He carried a continuation of love, fragile and breathing, a reminder that even in endings there are beginnings. And as the cat purred against his heart, every tear shed that day found its answer in that simple, unforgettable act of trust.